The ability to harness a creative process enables brands and creative teams to establish a rhythm that leads to more inspired ideas and concepts. Brand communication has become more of a science than ever, and it's a team effort that needs various voices from many walks of life. How do some people lead these creative processes successfully while finding brand and agency collaborations along the way? To find answers to these questions, in this episode, I'm excited to talk to Kojo Baffoe. He's a seasoned content creator, strategist, keynote speaker, and content producer. Kojo is the former editor of the men's business and lifestyle magazine, Destiny Man. He was also the host of Life with Kojo on KayaFM, among many other roles. He shares some of his experiences from working with various teams and brands where he built processes and led creative content strategy.
Everybody always goes, content is king, right?
Yes.
But for me, context is everything. Content is just content.
Yeah.
Until it's contextualized, until it's relevant, it is just words or pictures or videos, etc.
Having a process and multiple voices that are listened to, Kojo believes makes for brand stories that resonate. Enjoy the show. Welcome to The Lead Creative, where we talk to the creative minds behind some of the leading brands, businesses, organizations, and top ideas that we all love. Our chats range from building brands, conceptualizing new products, strategy, and building businesses. I'm your host, Mongezi Mtati. Kojo, thank you for making the time to join us.
No, thank you for having me.
To start off, Kojo, just looking at your profile, one of the things that stand out for me is the fact that you are of Ghanaian German heritage. You grew up in Lesotho. You came to Joburg and you lived, most of your life in Joburg, and you're based in Joburg now, but you've also traveled a lot, which led to a lot of your distinct experiences growing up and influencing your work as well. How do these unique experiences influence your thinking in the work that you do?
Well, I think it starts with, I do have kind of a very mixed heritage, but I think it starts with more growing up in Lesotho and going to a school that had multiple nationalities, whether it was in the student body or amongst our teachers. At some stage, it was said that we had up to 50 different nationalities in the school.
Wow, that's fascinating.
What that does is that, and then as a child also, I used to travel to Germany quite regularly to visit relatives until I was my early teens. And so what that does is that it gives you a certain perspective or understanding of yourself within context of the world overall. So my father used to say, we'll have our head office in Maseru and we'll have, branches in New York, Paris, London, etc. And it didn't seem far-fetched.
Yeah.
Right? Just from a conceptual perspective. It didn't happen. But at the end of the day, it didn't seem that far-fetched. So the thing about my background and my upbringing is it just taught me that to a certain extent, I have a place in the world.
Yeah.
Whatever spaces I go into, whatever spaces I occupy, I have as much right to be there as anybody else. And it's that understanding that is, it's not a thought about thing. It's just inherent in how I was raised and how I view the world.
Absolutely.
And then also, in essence, sitting on the fence, when I first started coming to South Africa after high school, when I was in varsity, because I went to varsity in Durban, and then this was like 92, where people would say you must pick a side. You pick a German, pick Ghanaian, pick black, pick white. You must pick a side and kind of plant a flag as to where you stand. And I've always said I don't need to pick a side. I'm very happily on the fence because each one of the places that I've grown up in, each one of the experiences that I've had, every influence that I've had has made me who I am. Yeah, it's a potpourri of experiences, and I couldn't pinpoint and say, okay, because of X, Y, Z, I think this particular way. But it's just a sum of all those experiences.
But I'm guessing that a lot of it also, I suppose, influenced how you view the world, because from the sound of it, no part of the world was almost too far off or far-fetched in your mind, even growing up.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like my mother was German. We left Germany when I was a baby. Like we eventually moved to Lesotho when I was about 3, 4 years old. And that's where I grew up, and that's where kind of home is. But at the same time, I still interacted with Germany in different ways. My heritage was never something that was kept secret or kept in the background. It's a part of who I am. I only went to Ghana when I was what? I went when I was about 5 years old, and then I went again when I was 38 years old.
Yeah.
But even going to Ghana, my father was Ghanaian, and although he naturalized in Lesotho, I grew up around Ghanaians. So the first time I went there, I felt at home, even though I'd never lived or been there.
Yeah.
There was an element that, that kind of, for me, felt at home. And Lesotho is the country that raised me. After varsity, I went back to Lesotho and I worked for a couple of years before I actually moved to Joburg. So each place does have influence, but I was also raised to, to be proud of and to acknowledge your heritage and where you come from. And, it's the old cliche, if you don't know where you come from, how are you going to know where you're going?
Absolutely. How did that then influence, I guess, or at least help to form your thinking in the creative pursuits that you then went on to develop in life?
What's very interesting is that, so my background, I did a BCom, I majored in economics, marketing, and business administration. I went into the family business, which was management consulting. We had an IT company. We had a couple of shops at some stage. That was the area I was going to go into. That was what I was going to do for the rest of my life. The more creative pursuits, I mean, like I was a sprinter, so I was a sports person, but I also wrote poetry. And I wrote poetry for me. Like, I always say when I started writing poetry, it was more therapy. It was a way of making sense of stuff. And writing in general, I was always encouraged to write. So I've always kind of written. And it was more a release for me. And, from a work perspective or from a professional perspective, I was writing reports and proposals for studies and on small business development and that sort of stuff. So if you had met me even as a, 24, 25-year-old, while I've always enjoyed and I've always been interested in things like music and explored those kind of things, but my path was very firmly on, I was going to be a entrepreneur, or I was, because I worked right through high school. I worked in weekends and holidays, and university, I also worked, and I used to go home once a month. I guess the more creative side of me, and I guess my personality and my character, came when I discovered the poetry scene in Joburg.
And at the time, you were, I suppose, founding minds of that movement, which went on to, I guess, first of all, take over Newtown quite a lot, and over time represent Africa on international stages.
Yeah, look, it was a very interesting time. I think it was an interesting time because there was a transition going on. So the poets that came before us, this was like 99, 2000, the poets that came before us had been part of the struggle to a certain extent, and it was very political. But now you had young South Africans having to grapple with more than just the politics, like, more the social issues and that sort of stuff. I mean, interesting enough, I just left an IT consulting company I'd started with a friend of mine, and I was working with a fashion designer, another friend who I was working with him to kind of just rebuild his business and rebuild his brand, and discovered Jungle Connection, which was in Doornfontein then, just because musician friends of mine were performing there that night. And when I went through, I saw people standing on a stage and doing poetry, and I was like, oh, you can do that? And then kind of started becoming a lot more active in that space. So that was when I probably started to pursue, call it the creative aspect of me a lot more. And then also, I mean, around, a couple of years after that, like the early 2000s, I worked as a booker at an actors agency. I had a cousin of mine who was in TV production, so I used to help him write TV concepts. Because of that, I started, I guess, in a way, I started kind of finding that balance between, let's call it the creative as well as the business world. Because, so for example, you're pitching a TV show, you need to be able to articulate the image that people have in their heads in such a way that the person commissioning will be able to see it. But it's not just articulating a creative concept, it's also articulating, production, like how is it going to run? What does the money look like? Are they guaranteed to get kind of bang for their buck?
Yes.
So because of that, I kind of found myself in that space. I've always written. I've always been, I'd like to think, relatively capable when it comes to writing. And I grew up writing a lot of business writing. And then doing the poetry, I was able to, there was a stage where it felt like I'd been able to find that medium between the two.
Yeah.
Where you kind of use one writing hat, or you have, I'd have the poetry lens influence how I write proposals.
Yes.
To add a lot more color to it, to make it a bit more visual. So the writing side, it was, one thing led to another. I've never really sat and planned and gone, okay, so I'm doing this now, so the next thing I'm going to do is that. It's often been just I'm doing this, I don't want to do this anymore. Oh, look, there's an opportunity there.
Yeah.
Does it make sense? Let me go and do it. Just
to fast forward quite a lot, from that time, with the poetry circle and when you were, I suppose, pitching shows early on and working on TV concepts. There was a time during your tenure as editor at Destiny Man that you were leading creative processes there, but also finding interesting themes for the magazine itself, right? How did you harness the creative thinking and the outputs while balancing those parts with the advertising side and then having to put together what was arguably, one of the most significant magazines of its time, when it was still in operation?
So what I always find interesting about the media is that the media presents a particular image, right? But behind the scenes can be grueling. It's long hours, it's hard, it can be hard work. But there's process to it. There's very simple and very clear processes in terms of how you put together, for example, an issue. The key thing for me, and it's something that I think we're still struggling with, particularly in this country when it comes to any kind of medium. Any storytelling medium, because all of this stuff is storytelling, right? So when I was Destiny Man, and I raised it with one or two advertisers, and I don't think my bosses or the advertisers were pleased, where I'd say, you want me to write an article about your product, and make it look like I'm writing about it because I wanted to write about it, because you don't want to advertise.
Mm-hmm.
Because with adverts, somebody looks at it and goes, it's an ad, and a lot of times people skim by.
Yes.
I'm like, but so if I do that, then when your competitors come and say, you did X for those people, we want the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
I start to lose credibility with my readers. If I lose credibility with my readers, they stop buying the magazine. They stop buying the magazine. You stop supporting the magazine. So at the heart of it, and I considered my job, yes, I had things that I was measured on within the business in terms of, sales of the magazine, advertising, and I'd go to meetings and, I'd do all of that sort of stuff. But I considered my job as basically custodian, or I was there representing the readers. And so in representing the readers, it's ensuring that whatever stories that we cover, one, reflect them, but also, it's reflect them in an honest and authentic way, but also then, share with them things that at the end of the day, we felt were relevant for them.
Yes.
But to do that, you need to understand who those people are, right? And where I say the struggle that we still have in this country in particular is that, frankly, when it comes to Black, there is no nuance.
Yes.
It's Black men are homogenous. Black women are homogenous. Whereas, in essence, we aren't. Whereas you could put 5 Black men in a room of the same age, and their interests and, their pursuits, etc., are very different. Yes, there's core threads that run through all of them, but there's also difference. I considered my job to be able to, unpack that nuance, and ensure that stories are relevant, tied into that nuance, and, at the same time, I've always operated with a bit of an agenda because I was brought up with a very Pan-African view of the world. My father grew up in Ghana, in Kwame Nkrumah's times, and that's what I was raised with. So sometimes I would squeeze stuff through that it's important that it's there.
Yes.
It's not necessarily, something that advertisers or anybody else would look at, but it's the subtleties, it's the subtleties. And I did this in radio as well. If you're talking about something scientific,
yes.
And it's a very simple example, but if you talk about something scientific, is there somebody who's Black or is colored or it's or is Indian or mixed race or however you want to define it,
Yeah.
that can come and talk about that because the norm has always been Caucasian.
Yes. Just on that, this notion of diversity, transformation, and representation actually comes up a lot. I mean, I think this is the third time in, 3 different episodes that it's coming up. How important is that? What you've just mentioned there, like finding different voices of color, voices that represent people in many spaces, especially when you represent the media, or at least are on the media side of content creation and putting content out there.
Look, it's very simple. It's not just about having a seat at the table. So the starting point is you need a diverse group of people sitting around the table because not everybody is going to have line of sight or understanding of the implications of particular decisions, right?
Yes.
So you want to have that diverse group around the table. But as important, or even more importantly, is that diverse group is actually listened to.
Yes.
Because this challenge we're still having is that you can see a diverse table, but who's making the final call? And, is the person making the final call open to hearing other perspectives? And I've had this, speaking to, for example, young Black professionals in advertising and communications where, they complain we're in the room, but nobody's listening to what we're saying, right? Nobody has that understanding. So, look, it's extremely important. I mean, so for example, you were talking about process. I mean, the process is very simple. In the magazine, we had certain sections that happened every issue. So you literally use that table of contents to guide you through the process. So you start with the first thing and you go, okay, well, is there a broader theme that we're looking at? And within that broader theme, then this particular article, we're going to profile a business person, who is out there. You come to an editorial meeting with ideas already.
Yes.
And everybody throws ideas around and you have a conversation around it. I guess as editor, to a certain extent, I mean, I answer to the publisher, but as editor, it'd be, okay, I like those two.
Yes.
Let's put those two down as options. You go through it like that. And if we have a particular topic, I mean, one of my favorite examples was having a conversation around doing a piece on, first of all, the deaths that have been happening around circumcision. And so there was a discussion around whether we should cover something like that. And so as a starting point, I didn't feel like it was relevant for us to cover because of who we were and who we were positioned. It's like the news and everybody else can talk about the negative story.
Yes.
I considered our job to highlight the good that was out there. And not blindly, not blindly highlighting. So, with some depth to it. That was my one concern. And then my second concern was that when it comes to, and at the time I went and researched it, when it came to, circumcision or that whole process, basically it's primarily because of people that do it. And that's the majority. So, and then with Tsonga and Venda as a smaller portion.
Yeah.
And so I was like, well, I mean, can we determine that the majority of our readers are Xhosa and therefore it's relevant to them? Is it relevant to all of us? Is it something that's important that we need to cover because a whole bunch of other people are covering it?
Yes.
And so in having discussions like that, if it's something that related to Chinese people or Japanese or, a Bulgarian, I perhaps don't have the context. It would be important to then have somebody with that context to be able to contribute to the conversation.
And I think a lot of the time we almost miss that very important nuance, I guess, that you bring up, where a story does not necessarily cover everybody and you need to be cognizant of the nuances of those people or that people that you are talking about.
Because even if you decide to do it,
yeah,
you need to make that decision being informed. You're making that decision very consciously to say, regardless of all of this other stuff, I feel it's something that needs to be talked about. And I feel it's something that, for example, our readers need to hear. And therefore, that's why we're doing it. We used to run events and I'd have, my readers would come to the events. And without fail, eventually what I used to do when I got on stage, I used to open up with why we have a certain person on the cover. Because I knew that without fail, the guys would be like, okay, why'd you have so-and-so on the cover? I don't think it's a good idea. And you're never going to please everybody.
Yes.
So a lot of times it'd be, okay, well, I acknowledge that you don't agree with that person on the cover, but this is why we did it. And to be able to say, this is why we did it, you need to be clear on it. You need to go through that process of that decision-making process to go, at the end of the day, this is like we stand by what we did. Yes. And sometimes I had to stand by stuff the way the publisher's like, I don't agree with it. And then the publisher's like, okay, but we're going to do it anyway. And then once that decision has been made, I'm the person who has to go up and stand for it. And I'm not going to stand up and go, yeah, I didn't want this thing to happen. Therefore, because we've gone through a process and I understand why. I may not agree, but I understand why. That's why we've done that. And so when I'm out in public, I would stand, I'd stand by.
You mentioned something else, Kojo, in part of the process that you worked around and the team and how you worked with the team. The fact that you have to be cognizant of and enable all voices to be heard as the leader, of a creative team or as somebody who leads a creative process, who's senior in that process. How do you reach that point? How do you get to a point where even, the most junior person in a team whose confidence may not be at the level of the most senior person in that team, for them to raise their voice in a way that is beneficial for the whole and for the creative process, such that, that voice comes out and that voice is not only heard, but reflected in what you produce?
So with the editorial teams that I've had, it was, like I sit and I go, you want to get the different people. So if anybody, so the fashion intern is going to sit in the meeting with the fashion director, right? And the fashion, or the fashion edit, and the fashion edit is going to come with certain ideas. And no one person can know everything, right?
Yes.
Because particularly when you're dealing with content, like even now I'll put together an editorial plan and it's, you're spending a lot of time just trying to figure out where to get ideas for stories or people to interview. So I'm not going to know everybody who is out there. So it was important to be sitting in a room with people who knew that if we're talking about something and you know of someone, or you've heard of a business, or you've heard of an experience, or you've heard of a product, to say, oh, I heard about this particular product. And then for us to sit and go, okay, well, let's look at it and let's unpack it. And somebody else may go, yeah, I'd heard about it, but this is what I heard. And, the beauty of the internet these days is that while you're sitting there, you can literally Google that stuff.
Absolutely.
Recently, I was sitting, there's a guy who runs sessions, strategy sessions, and he asked me to facilitate them. And so recently I was on a call with the team, and they have an intern and he has somebody that works with him. And we were talking about who next to host. It's called the Think and Newer strategy sessions, but we were talking about who next to have, on the thing. And, the woman says to me, Kojo, so do you have any ideas? Have you thought of anything? I'm like, no, I haven't. Like, I literally hadn't processed. I'm dealing with life and I just came on the call. And then she's like, okay, well, this is what we found.
Yes.
Here are 3 story ideas. And we went through, we spent 30 minutes and we went through each one, right? So the first one, I'm like, okay, I hear you on that. But what I like is this, but I think it's a problem with that. The second one, I'm like, I absolutely love that one, right?
Yes.
And I guess it comes from production. So doing TV production, the person that nobody ever takes into consideration is the researcher. But the researcher is the person who's going out and actually finding the stories. And I found that when I was in production, my researcher, I could see when he really bought into a particular story, because how he presents that story, he's going to unpack the thing. And then the other stories be like, yeah, so this person, they have this business. I think that'd be really dope to interview. And then you're having to probe. You're having to go, okay, but what about this? And what about that? But honestly, creating a space where it's like, okay, well, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think? What do you think? And, at the same time, accepting that at the end of the day, for example, the buck stops somewhere. So if you're the person where the buck stops, that's where it stops. And it's being able to be inclusive and open, but also at some point then going, okay, well, I have heard what you said, but this is what we're going to do because I don't agree with X, Y, Z. And doing it in such a way that people don't sit and are not offended. At the end of the day, all we want is for our voices to be heard.
Yes.
And for what we're contributing to be engaged with. Once that's happened, it's also understanding that it's not always going to go your way. And that's what happens when you work for somebody. Everybody always has a boss. I freelance, but my bosses are then my clients. Like I may think that we should do things a particular way, but at the end of the day, they'll go, okay, cool. This is the way we're going. And then I have to execute on it, right?
Just to switch things a little bit without, I think, talking only about your experiences in the sort of editorial space and now strategy, right? I mean, as a content strategist, you see and work with many brands, and I think sometimes you probably look at certain brand messages with that hat on, with the hat of this brand is getting it right or this brand consistently gets it wrong. And there have been many instances in recent times when brands have been getting it wrong.
Absolutely.
But are there brands that almost consistently get it right in telling brand stories and telling these stories in a way that has a positive Pan-African outlook to it? Because you mentioned that you have that Pan-African outlook to some of the work that you do, or at least you brought it into some of the rooms that some of the big boardrooms that you were in. Are there brands that get it right, like that tell stories in a way that resonates from a sort of Pan-African perspective, that are doing it well in your perspective?
Look, the starting point for me for everything is who's your community?
Yeah.
And who are you and what do you stand for? And then being able to communicate that consistently. But understanding that that community is diverse. And, this continent is a diverse continent. So the biggest challenge we've always had, and we see it here, but you see it continentally, is where brands try to, paint with one brush.
Yes.
And you can't do that because people are so diverse and so different. So, let's call it from a comms perspective, off the top of my head, I don't know brands nobody pops into my mind where I can go, okay, well, that particular brand, when it comes to a presence in multiple countries, they're getting it totally right. But I think it's more about their operations in those countries and what they're doing in those specific countries. So if you look at like an MTN, you look at like a ShopRite. I can't sit in South Africa and go, they're getting it right in Kenya until I really go into Kenya, I can engage with them from that perspective. I was having a recent conversation. What's been interesting for me with ShopRite in particular is that, and I think that's where some of the other, supermarkets and retailers have struggled, is that ShopRite, without fail, always has products from the country on their shelves. So while they bring in everything like everybody else does, there's certain products that people of a country, that's what they like, that's what they eat.
Yes.
And it's not just coming and transplanting. And look, South African companies have done that for years and bent their fingers, where it literally is a coming and transplanting what worked in South Africa into a different country. I watched games set up in Ghana. Yeah. And I remember going into the game and the manager was a white South African man. And you're going, but does this person understand the nuances of the environment, even if the products are what I get down the road? I think there are brands that are doing it, but it's doing it from a operational and business perspective. The key is knowing who your community is and understanding your community. That's what I always go back to.
Yes.
I always go back to understand who, not my market, but understand who my community is, and then ensure that I'm relevant and contextual within them. So one of my cheesy lines is, because everybody always goes, content is king, right?
Yes.
But for me, context is everything. Content is just content.
Yeah.
Until it's contextualized, until it's relevant, it is just words or pictures or videos, etc.
Yes. Can you tell us anything about the book that you are busy writing at the moment? Because I know you're...
Yeah. It's a weird book. It's weird in that I think, imposter syndrome is real for a lot of us. And I've even written blog posts around it.
Yeah.
So, I always joke and I say it's my 5th book, but it's the first one that I'm actually going to put to paper.
Yeah.
So I started, initially I was looking to write a book on fatherhood when my son was born, and he's now 13. And just kind of the lessons I've learned from being a father, because, it teaches you a lot if you allow it to, things like consistency and setting precedent and, having fun, yada, yada. And then over the years, I've kind of I was like, okay, let me do a business book using fatherhood as the basis. And my father passed away a couple of years back, and I'd been talking to him about writing his life story. Because I find, like, I grew up in one place and then I moved to another place. But when I look at my father's life, that's what I found kind of a lot more fascinating. And he was my only parent from when I was 1, because my mother passed away when I was 1. So after he passed away, I realized he hadn't written much. And I was like, okay, maybe I should write a book about his life from my perspective. So now my book basically is basically reflections on being a son, being a father, being a man, being an African man, and the things that I've kind of learned from the different experiences that I've had.
Yeah.
So it literally it's going to have some poetry in there. I haven't written poetry consistently in over a decade, but I will have some poetry in there. And it's just a reflection on these different things, a reflection on, like, my mother passed when I was young. So that impacted on my relationship with women and my journey through life. My father we are 5 kids from 3 different mothers of 3 different nationalities, and my father raised all of us. And so even my perspectives on the role of a father. And so, it's really that. It's reflections, it's thoughts, it's like a series of essays and poems and reflections on life and the things that I've learned along the way.
And you bring in fatherhood quite a bit. I mean, I know that there's a keynote talk of yours that has something to do with fatherhood as well in it. In fact, it's not even a question. I think it just shows that this for you is an important topic and important enough to also include in your book and also to kind of write about it the way that you are. I'm just wondering how this personal experience comes out in in the book itself, or how you're finding the process of putting it into a book.
Look, it's a lot of reflections on stuff. And look, fatherhood is important to me. For a long time, the idea of having children was easier than the idea of having a partner to have the children with.
Sure.
Which is very weird. But also the way I was raised, like, my children are my children. I've joked sometimes, like, if heaven forbid my wife and I were to separate, I'm like, I'd probably stay next door. Because, I considered that's kind of my biggest responsibility and my biggest duty in this world, is to ensure that my children, have the opportunity or have the foundation for them to be able to go and do whatever it is that they want to do with their life.
Absolutely.
The first time I left Destiny Man, a very big reason why I left Destiny Man was because of my children, because I was never home and I was always traveling. And I was just like, presence, physical presence is as important, if not more, it was more important than physical, than presence with a T. And so I do reflect on it quite a bit. And I guess it's being a writer. So a lot of times I experience life and watch life at the same time. When it comes to parenting and when it comes to things that are often charged with emotion, you don't always get it right in the moment, but I honestly do spend a lot of time just reflecting on how to be a better version of me, and which means a better father, a better friend, a better son, a better husband, etc. So with my kids, because children also show you up. They put a spotlight on your flaws.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I've got a 13-year-old now. My son is becoming a teenager, and all of a sudden I've spent the last year, after thinking I've got a handle on this. I'm good. I got it, right?
Yeah, I know this.
Yeah. And then my son's becoming a teenager, and that's also, it's impacted on our relationship, but it's not just him being different. It's also me reflecting and going, okay, maybe I'm not doing, like, I need to do certain things differently.
Yes.
And it's a constant thing.
Because I mean, a number of parents talk about, also being open to figuring it out as you go and as your kids grow and as your family grows as well, because all kids are individuals.
Yeah.
And the relationships are unique as well.
And that's all you can do, because, I mean, another cliche, but there is no manual, but there really isn't a manual. And you're dealing with a unique individual. And like you're saying, each child has their own personality.
Yes.
But also they're evolving, just like, well, we should be evolving. I mean, I think we slow down or we stagnate as we grow older, but they're evolving at a rapid pace, like a 2-year-old versus a 3-year-old.
Yes.
A 3-year-old versus a 6-year-old, a 6-year-old versus a 9-year-old, right? So every time you think, okay, you've got this right, they're evolving, and sometimes you have to evolve with them.
Yeah.
So the most important thing for me is always values. So there's certain values and there's certain principles that are important, for example, to me. And I was listening to an interview and a guy was talking about foundational values, right? So there's certain values that are at the heart of kind of who I am and how I operate and how I see the world. And that stems from my father and before. So we're this chain, right? So it's important that my children learn the same values, respect for others, respect for yourself, integrity, honesty, etc. Once you get beyond that, it's a minefield.
And I really look forward to reading the book and how how all of this comes together, all of these reflections and the life experiences, I suppose, that will come out of it as well.
The pressure, man. The pressure.
No pressure at all. Not for you. Just in closing, Kojo, just to go back to, I guess, the content creation and the creative processes that we were talking about earlier. What can brands and creative teams do to harness and build creative processes that lead to content, to campaigns and concepts that resonate with their audiences?
So I think it's a kind of mixture of creating a framework. I'm a big believer in kind of logical paths and steps, right? So it's, you start here. So you need to create that framework, but within it, you need to then also leave room for, let's call it exploration. Because also that's often where the broader ideas come in. But it's really about creating, a space where people feel comfortable bringing themselves to the table.
Yes.
I used to do a talk, and one of the things I used to say was that I always find it very weird how people leave themselves at home when they go to work. So, and you look at social media, especially like the early days of Twitter when we used to complain about brands and that sort of stuff. You'll see somebody complaining about a particular service or a particular brand, etc., that has wronged them in some way. And then they go to work with a different brand. Then when they engage with you, who are now complaining, they engage with you in a particular way. So it's like they've left themselves at home.
Yeah, they almost distance themselves from the strains and stresses that brands cause them.
Yeah, and I think it's because, companies will then create these structures that leave no room for the people themselves to bring something to the table, right? If you look at a lot of the challenges that the mishaps that brands will have, like on social media, and you go, if you had not just the diversity, but allowed people to bring themselves to the table, somebody would have gone, no, hold on. Like, do you see this?
Yes.
And to do that, you need to create the kind of space where people feel comfortable bringing that to the table. It's that balance between process and ensuring that there is a process, because then it just becomes a free-for-all, which is counterproductive. But also in the gaps, leaving room for people to bring themselves to the table. And look, this conversation around diversity, it's an entertaining one sitting on the African continent and still having that conversation. Like, you can understand from an American, a European perspective. But within this country, I mean, there is a unique history, which you don't find even across the continent. I mean, my father and I were contemplating starting a magazine in Ghana years ago after I'd worked, because my first magazine job was at Black Magazine.
Yeah.
And my father was like, that in Ghana, you can't do this Black men's lifestyle magazine. It's like, it's a men's lifestyle magazine.
Yeah.
There's no descriptor.
Yes.
There's no racial descriptor. It's a Ghanaian's men's magazine, or it's a men's magazine, or it's a lifestyle magazine. So ensuring that there's multiple voices and the voices are listened to, not heard, but listened to, and action comes out of that. At the same time, ensuring that you have process.
Absolutely. On that very powerful note, Kojo, thank you very much for making the time.
Thank you, man.
I look forward to reading the book when it comes out.
Thank you for listening to The Lead Creative. Did you get one insight that's worth sharing from this episode? Please share it with a friend or anyone who might like it. pop me some of your ideas and innovative finds on Twitter @Mongezi. This podcast is available on Spotify, Stitcher, Google, Apple, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. This podcast is also hosted on iafrican.com/radio. You can find me and more of my content on mongezi.com.